The office smelled like old paper and the particular kind of patience that came from spending years in the company of the dead. Iris Vale had worked in this room for 9 years. She had a second-hand typewriter, 3 filing cabinets, and a policy of not asking who was calling before she picked up the phone, because in her line of work the question was never who was calling. The question was always, who died? She worked nights because most families did not want to think about obituaries in daylight. They wanted the darkness to do some of the work. She worked nights also because the kind of calls she received most often, the ones from families who did not appear in telephone directories and whose dead did not appear in police reports. Those calls came when the city's other systems were quiet. Powerful men often mistook Iris's softness for permission to hand her their lies. She was not the kind of woman that powerful men found threatening. She was soft-spoken, deliberate, with a face and a body that the families she worked for tended to read as unthreatening. She had learned early in this work that this was an advantage. People told the truth to people they did not believe were listening. Iris listened to everything. She listened to the space between a name written first and a name written last. She listened to the absence of a name that should have been there. She listened to the grief that was real and the grief that was performance. And she had spent 9 years learning to tell the difference by the way people chose their words when they thought they were choosing them alone. She was the only person in the city who read obituaries the way a detective read crime scenes. Most people read them to mourn. She read them to understand who had controlled the story and what the story was hiding. The envelope arrived under the door at 11:04 p.m. No knock, no footsteps afterward. She picked it up. Inside, cash, a handwritten list of names and relationships, and a brief instruction. Obituary for Dante Bellandi, for publication tomorrow. She set it on her desk and began to read. She read the way she always read requests like this one. Not linearly, not the way a reader read a story, but the way a surveyor moved across a piece of land, looking for the things that did not fit the natural grade. An obituary was a map of what a family wanted to be believed. The decisions made in the language were the decisions made about who the dead had been and who the living were going to be. She had read hundreds of them. She had learned to identify the specific sentence constructions that signaled a death the family had agreed on rather than mourned. She had learned to identify the particular grammar of managed grief. She read the first line, Dante Bellandi passed peacefully at 11:40 p.m. She read it 3 times. She had written obituaries for 41 people connected to Mafia families. None of them had passed peacefully. The phrase existed in a specific grammar of Mafia obituaries that meant, "This death is the version we have agreed on." She read further. The second line placed Lorenzo Bellandi, Dante's cousin, in the position immediately following Dante's mother. In Bellandi obituary tradition, that position belonged to the designated inheritor. The name had been placed there with the particular deliberateness of a word chosen because every other word had been rejected. The third section listed the people who survived Dante. 3 names were missing. 3 names of people she knew were among the capos most loyal to Dante, people whose names had appeared in every previous Bellandi family announcement. In an obituary, a name omitted from survived by was a name the family had decided did not need to continue. She found the phrase, "honored by 9 witnesses," in the 5th paragraph. It did not belong there grammatically. It had been placed there the way a pin is placed in a document, not for the reader, but for the people who knew what a pin in that position meant. 9 witnesses. Council of 9. She set the paper down. The door opened. A man walked in and sat down across from her desk without being invited. He was tall, controlled, with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to entering rooms and finding them already arranged around his presence. He looked at the paper on her desk. She looked at him. She said, "You are early for your own death." Dante Bellandi said, "That depends. Did they write it well?" He wanted to know who had sent the envelope. She understood that impulse and set it aside. "You can find the person who sent it," she said, "or you can understand what they built before you do." She laid the obituary flat on the desk between them and walked him through it. Not as a document, as a scene. She had done this kind of reading for 9 years. Not always with material this deliberate. Sometimes it was simply a family that had quietly agreed on a version of events and needed a professional to make that version sound natural. She had written those in the early years of this work without fully understanding what she was doing. She had understood eventually. She had also understood that her ability to recognize the grammar of a managed death was not knowledge she could give back. It was, now, a form of power she had not asked for and had not been warned about. She laid the obituary flat and walked Dante through it, not because she needed to explain it to him, but because she needed him to understand that she was not guessing, not as a document, as a scene. The positioning of Lorenzo's name, not a family announcement, a succession announcement. The absence of 3 capos from survived by. In Mafia obituary language, this did not mean they had predeceased Dante. It meant they had been removed from the family's living structure. The phrase, "honored by 9 witnesses," she had seen this construction once before, in a document that had led to her father's death, and it had not been decoration then either. It was a signature, a record of organizational consent. And the time, 11:40 p.m. "In 3 days," she said, "there is a window in the Bellandi security rotation. Your personal detail leaves the rear corridor at 11:38 p.m. and returns at 11:46. Someone who had access to your schedule wrote that time into a death announcement." Dante was quiet. "This is not an obituary," she said. "It is a schedule written in mourning clothes." He reached across the desk for the paper. She put her hand on it. "If you tear up the death they wrote for you," she said, "they will simply write a quieter one." He looked at her hand, at the paper, at her. "The printer copy was sent simultaneously to your family funeral home and the council clerk," she said. "Which means if this document disappears, 2 other copies exist. And the people who sent this will know within hours that their timeline has been disrupted. What do you suggest? Let them believe it worked." She explained the architecture of a fake funeral. The Bellandi funeral home had a crypt beneath the main chapel. The crypt connected to the main floor through a passage behind the altar. If Dante stood in the crypt, he could hear everything in the chapel above. He could appear from behind the altar at whatever moment the evidence was complete. He said, "You want me to attend my own funeral." "No," she said. "I want you to listen to who smiles at it." She watched him work through what that required. He would have to stay silent. He would not be able to stop what was being said. He would have to hear people speak about his death in the past tense. He would have to hear whoever had arranged this say whatever they had prepared to say. She understood that for a man of his particular construction, a man who had ordered things to happen and had things happen because he ordered them, this was not a tactical inconvenience. It was the thing he was least equipped to endure. You have spent years making sure the story about you was the story you wanted, she said. They are counting on you to interrupt this before it can go public. The only way to catch the full network is to let the story run until the people who wrote it have no way to deny they wrote it. Dante said he was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it. He was not a man who reacted visibly. He was a man who processed efficiently and acted from conclusions. She could see, beneath the stillness, the specific recalibration of someone who had just been told that a system they had believed was secure had been breached by a method they had not imagined. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" "Writing obituaries, reading them," she said, "long enough to know the difference between a death that was mourned and a death that was managed." She found the file on her father in the third drawer of the left cabinet. She had not opened it in 2 years, not because she had stopped thinking about it, because she had learned that looking at it on nights when she had no leverage made the knowledge worse rather than better. Tonight she had leverage. Marcel Vale had been an obituary writer in this same office. He had received a request to write a death announcement for a man who had not yet died. He had recognized what it was. He had refused. 6 days later, he died in an accident. The accident had been clean, too clean, the kind of clean that required a particular level of institutional cooperation. She opened the file and found the draft obituary her father had begun to write. In the 5th paragraph, the phrase, "honored by 9 witnesses." She had known it was there. Seeing it again in the context of a new document, a new family, a new night, made it something different from a memory. It made it a pattern. She looked at the name at the bottom of the original request that had been sent to her father. Don Aurelio Venn, Elder of the Council of 9. She put the file on the desk beside Dante's obituary. He had been watching her. She said, "The phrase in this document that signals council authorization. The same phrase appears in a document my father was given the night before he refused to write a lie for a Mafia family." Dante looked at both documents. "The same man signed both requests," she said. "Don Aurelio Venn is on the guest list for tomorrow's service." Dante said, "You do not have to stand in that chapel." She looked at him. "My father died because he refused to write a lie," she said. "I will not live by reading one softly." The Bellandi funeral home occupied a building that had been designed to look like grief was its primary function. Wide stairs, dark wood, flowers that had been expensive when ordered. Iris arrived early and walked the chapel with Father Silvio, who had been retained to officiate. Rafe Calder arrived before Iris, which she noted. He was one of the 3 capos whose names had been removed from the obituary. He had been told, through one of the remaining secure channels, that he had been written out of the family structure. He had responded by arriving at the funeral home 2 hours early and saying nothing to anyone. He positioned himself near the side door. Father Silvio was a small, careful man who knew the words for grief in 4 languages and had the particular experience of a person who had spent many years saying them in rooms where the stated cause of death was unlikely. He was also a man who, Iris suspected, had been placed here the way pieces were placed, not because he had chosen to be here, but because someone had needed him to be. She asked him how long he had worked with the Bellandi family. He said 11 years. She asked if he had worked with Don Aurelio. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "There are things you are held responsible for, even when you had no good alternative." She understood. She told him what she needed. She needed the thematic sequence of his address adjusted so the phrase "honored by 9 witnesses" was read while every invited council member was standing. She needed the microphone left open. She needed the crypt passage unlocked. He did not ask her to explain any of it. He took a folded paper from his jacket pocket. He placed it on the altar. "I confirmed receipt of the obituary at 8:47 p.m. yesterday," he said, "before any death had been announced, before the family had been notified, before any of the standard procedures. He had the timestamp. If you need a witness for the sequence of events," he said. She thanked him. Outside the chapel, she watched the seating plan materialize. The families arrived in the order the obituary had implied they would arrive. Each group took the position the document had assigned them in a room arranged around a death that had not yet occurred. Don Aurelio Venn arrived with 3 council members. He looked at Iris in the way men of his generation sometimes looked at women in professional settings, noting her presence, calibrating its significance, and arriving at a number that was lower than the accurate one. Lorenzo Bellandi arrived last and stood nearest the altar, which was where the obituary had placed him. He was practicing. Iris understood. He was practicing being the center of the room. When the service began, she sat in the second row and listened to Father Silvio's opening. Beneath her, 12 feet below the chapel floor, behind 3 inches of stone and the particular acoustic quality of a crypt that had been built to carry nothing upward, Dante Bellandi was listening. She could not see him. She could not know what he was thinking. But she thought about what it required to stand in a room designed to hold the dead, while the living gathered above to determine who you had been. She thought about what it meant to hear your own name spoken in the past tense by people who had decided, while you were still breathing, what the tense of your existence would be. She thought about the word peacefully, used about a man who had never done anything peacefully in his adult life. She thought that if you could survive hearing that without moving, you had learned something about patience that could not be taught any other way. Behind the altar wall, in the crypt, she knew Dante was listening too. The service opened with music, something that sounded like mourning without being specific about it. Lorenzo spoke first. He walked to the podium with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this. He said, at one point, something she had not expected to be said aloud. A boss dies twice. Once when his heart stops, once when the city agrees who replaces him. Dante would have wanted the city to agree quietly. She noted the verb tense. Would have wanted. Lorenzo had already moved Dante into the past. He described Dante as a man who had passed peacefully, a man of quiet strength, a man who had prepared his house. Each phrase was a specific erasure, passed peacefully. The death was not violent, nothing needed investigating. Quiet strength. The leadership had not been contested. prepared his house, the succession was already arranged. Each phrase was a brushstroke in a painting of a death that had been arranged. Iris thought about her father, about the night he had read a document and understood what he was being asked to say, and said no instead, about how the city had processed his death and moved on. She thought about Dante standing 12 feet below the floor, hearing himself described as a prepared, peaceful, quiet man. She did not think that was a thing he was capable of experiencing without it changing him. She stood when Father Silvio called the audience to remember the life of Dante Bellandi. She walked to the podium. She set the paper down. She had thought about what she would say in this moment more times than she could count. Not the words. She had not scripted this. She had thought about the position of a woman who had spent 9 years making the deaths of powerful people legible, who had made herself quiet and soft and unalarming specifically so that she could be in rooms like this one, and who had now reached the moment where being in the room was not enough, where being in the room meant something. She looked at Don Aurelio Venn. She looked at Lorenzo. She looked at the council clerk who had received a death announcement 12 hours before the death had been announced. She looked at the room, and she began. She started with 2 minutes of exactly what they expected. Her voice was level. The cadences were correct. The room relaxed in the way rooms relaxed when they were hearing what they had paid to hear. Then she stopped. She said, Dante Bellandi did not pass peacefully at 11:40 p.m. She did not raise her voice. She continued at the same level. 11:40 is a specific time. It corresponds to a gap in the personal security rotation that can be confirmed by the building's staffing logs. Someone with access to that schedule chose it as a time of death before any death had occurred. She heard the room shift. She continued. The name Lorenzo Bellandi appears in this document in a position that, by family tradition, designates the successor. This position was assigned in a document prepared before the death it announced. Lorenzo stood. Iris did not stop. The names of 3 capos, loyal to Dante for a combined total of 31 years, do not appear in the list of survivors. An omission in this position in a family of this kind is not accidental. It is a removal, Don Aurelio said. Father Silvio, this is not. He did not deny the phrase. He only looked annoyed that someone outside the council knew how to read it. Father Silvio did not reach for the microphone. Iris said, The phrase honored by 9 witnesses appears in paragraph 5. It does not belong there grammatically. It belongs there institutionally. It is a record of organizational consent. I have seen this phrase before in a document sent to my father, Marcel Vale, the night before he was asked to write a death announcement for a man who was still alive. He refused. He died 6 days later. The request that was sent to him was signed by the same name I found on the guest list for this service. She looked at Don Aurelio. The room was very quiet. I am not the author of these observations, she said. The obituary is. I am only reading it correctly. A council member said she was a writer making accusations she had no standing to make. She said, a bullet can end a life. An obituary decides who gets to lie about it. She lifted the document. I was paid to write this. The payment came before any death had occurred. The printer copy was sent to 3 locations simultaneously. This funeral home, the council clerk's office, and my office. I have confirmed the timestamps. Father Silvio has confirmed his timestamp. The council clerk is in this room." She looked at the clerk. "At what time did you receive your copy?" The clerk looked at Don Aurelio, then looked at his watch, then said very quietly, 8:51 p.m. yesterday. Iris said, "The death was announced this morning." The document describing that death was distributed 12 hours before the announcement. She set the paper down. The dead are not offended by truth. Only the living who plan to profit from silence are. Lorenzo said, "You are a hired writer. You have no authority in this room." Iris looked at him. "Then why did you pay me to bury him before he died?" Lorenzo's face changed. He said, "That is not." He stopped. He looked at Father Silvio, at the microphone. He understood. He said, "That statement was supposed to be delivered after Dante was no longer in a position to walk into this room." Iris said, "Yes, I know. The room heard it." Father Silvio stood at the side of the chapel with his hands folded, and he did not reach for the microphone, and the microphone continued to receive everything in the room with the specific patience of a system that had been left running by a person who had decided it should run. Lorenzo looked at Father Silvio. Father Silvio looked at Lorenzo with the expression of a man who had been carrying a debt for 11 years and had just paid the last payment. Then the wall behind the altar opened. Dante Bellandi walked through the crypt passage and into the chapel. The room did not make a sound. He looked at Lorenzo. "You planned my death better than you ever served my life." He stood in the center of the chapel for a moment and looked at the room. He looked at the flowers that had been ordered for a death that had not yet occurred, at the seating order that had placed his replacement beside his mother, at the council who had organized their own attendance around a power structure they expected to inherit in the next 48 hours. He had spent his adult life ensuring that no one in this city could make a major decision about the Bellandi family without his knowledge. He understood now that knowledge was not enough. Someone could know you and also know exactly how to replace you. Someone could have arranged everything: the flowers, the sequence, the names, the missing names, while standing in the same rooms as you and saying the right things to the right people. He looked at Iris. She had not moved from the podium. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who had known this moment was coming and had not known whether knowing would make it easier. He looked at the council. He said, "The document was prepared before my death. Father Silvio received it at 8:47 p.m. The council clerk received it at 8:51 p.m. I was alive at both times. I am alive now." He looked at Iris. She looked back at him. He said to the room, "Lorenzo Bellandi organized this succession. Don Aurelio Venn authenticated it with the council seal. Both will be held for full questioning." Lorenzo moved toward the side door. Rafe Calder, one of the 3 capos whose name had been removed from the obituary, was standing at that door. He had been standing there since the service began. He had arrived early, which Iris had noticed, and had positioned himself where the document's seating order had tried to make him disappear. Dante had moved the people that the document had tried to erase to the places the document had tried to erase them from. Lorenzo stopped. Don Aurelio sat down. He sat with the controlled quality of a man deciding that remaining seated was a form of authority. He was not wrong. Remaining in a room and maintaining composure was a form of authority. But the microphone had been open. The council clerk had spoken. The timestamps existed in 3 separate locations, and authority, Iris had learned, required a story. The story of this room had just been changed. Council members looked at each other, not with panic, with the specific assessment of people calculating what they knew and who else knew it. She understood that what happened in the next several days would depend heavily on how quickly each of them decided where their interests lay. That was not tonight's problem. Tonight's problem had been named. Lorenzo had been placed in a position from which there was no useful response. He was not being arrested. He was being documented. There was a significant difference. The room was very still. Dante turned to Iris. "You turned my funeral into a courtroom." Iris said, "No, they did. I only read the program." 3 days after the funeral, Dante met Iris in the archive room beneath the Bellandi funeral home. The archive contained bound volumes of family records, obituaries, wills, succession documents, death certificates, records of transfers and agreements that had never been signed in any space accessible to the public. The history of the family in its own handwriting. He said, "I want you to write for me." "No," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to become the keeper of these records, the archive, the family history." She said, "You want me to write for you. I want you to write what I cannot afford to lie about." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the volumes. She thought about her father, about the word refused, about the 6 days after he said it. She said, "I will maintain the archive." On these terms, she put 3 conditions on the table. First, she retained a complete independent copy at her own office. Not a copy she shared with Bellandi, a copy she held. Second, if anyone in the Bellandi family asked her to alter a record, to call a killing a quiet death, to call a betrayal a succession, to remove names from living documents, she would stop and the arrangement would end. Third, if the arrangement ended because someone tried to edit the truth, she would publish everything she held. She said, "I will not call a purge a passing. I will not say someone died peacefully when they did not. I will not remove names from history because it is convenient." Dante looked at her. He had been a man for a long time who had made arrangements with people from a position of what he could offer and what he could threaten. This arrangement had neither. She was offering him accuracy in exchange for the right to have accuracy mean something. He had been quiet for a long time after she stated her terms. She let the silence run. She had learned, in years of sitting with families in the hardest conversations, that silence was not an absence. It was a presence. It was the sound of a person actually considering something rather than performing consideration. He said, "Those terms do not benefit me." She said, "They benefit the people whose names you might otherwise decide to edit." He looked at her. She said, "That is the arrangement." He put the key to the archive on the table. He did not place it in her hand. He placed it where she could choose to take it. She took it. The archive room was very quiet. She thought about her father, about the 9 years between his death and this room, about the word refused and what it had cost. She thought, this is not the same as refusing. This is not the same as what he did. But she thought, also, this is why he did it, so that someone eventually could be in a room like this one and hold the key. Every elegant sentence could hide a knife. Iris Vale had spent her life watching powerful men hand her the blade and call it mourning. But at Dante Bellandi's funeral, she turned the blade around, And from that night on, the dead of the Mafia had someone willing to write their names before the living could lie about them. Was Iris right to turn Dante's fake funeral into a courtroom, or did she become exactly what the Mafia needed? Someone who could make their truths sound official? Share your answer below, and subscribe to Mafia Hearts and Secrets for more dangerous romances hidden inside the underworld's most powerful families.